John watched in horror as the HOA security guard grabbed his cousin's crutch and hurled it across the courtyard. His cousin, battered, bandaged, and barely able to stand, crumpled to the ground. The angry mob cheered as the guard slapped handcuffs on his cousin's wrists. This wasn't supposed to happen. His cousin was the victim, not the criminal. John knew he had to act fast before the situation spiraled out of control. The truth had to come out. Justice had to be served. John's heart raced as he pushed through the jeering crowd, desperate to reach his cousin. Hey, let him go. He didn't do anything wrong. The burly security guard turned, his grip tightening around the handcuffs. Stay back, or you're next. This hooligan assaulted one of our residents. That's a lie, John shouted, inching closer. My cousin was the one attacked. You saw what happened. The guard sneered. I saw a man causing a disturbance and resisting arrest. Now back off before I haul you in too. John's cousin looked up, his eyes pleading. John, please. You have to tell them what really happened. John knew he had to act fast. The residents were growing more agitated, some hurling insults and threats in his cousin's direction. He had to find a way to defuse the situation and get the truth out before the HOA made an irreversible mistake. Please, listen to me, John begged, addressing the crowd. My cousin is the victim here. He was just walking through the courtyard when one of your residents came up and started shoving him. When my cousin tried to defend himself, your security guard attacked him and knocked him to the ground. The guard scoffed. That's not what I saw. This troublemaker was causing a disturbance and needed to be restrained. John clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. You're lying. My cousin was just trying to get home when he was assaulted. And now you're the one assaulting him by taking away his crutch and handcuffing him. This is wrong, and everyone here knows it. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others still shouting curses. John knew he had to find a way to turn the tide before his cousin was hauled away. Look, I get that you all want to maintain order in this community, John said, raising his hands. But that doesn't mean you can just trample all over someone's rights. My cousin is the victim here, and he deserves justice, not to be treated like a criminal. The guard's face turned red, and he took a step towards John. That's it. You're both under arrest for disturbing the peace and resisting. But before he could finish, a voice from the crowd interrupted him. Wait a minute, a woman said, stepping forward. I saw what happened. That security guard is lying. He's the one who attacked the man with the crutch. The guard's face paled, and the crowd erupted in murmurs and shouts. John knew this was his chance to turn the tables and get the truth out. He had to act fast before the situation spiraled out of control. The woman's words hung in the air, instantly shifting the mood of the crowd. The security guard's face twisted with panic as the onlookers began murmuring and turning against him. What? That's not true, the guard sputtered, his grip loosening on the handcuffs. I was just doing my job to maintain order. John seized the opportunity, stepping forward to address the crowd. You all saw what happened. This guard attacked my cousin, who was just trying to get home. He has no right to handcuff an innocent victim. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. John could feel the tide turning in his favor. He knew he had to keep pressing. Look, I get that we all want to feel safe in our community, John continued. But that doesn't mean we sacrifice our basic rights and dignity. My cousin was assaulted, and now he's being treated like a criminal. That's not right, and I won't stand for it. The crowd erupted in applause, some even shouting words of support for John and his cousin. The guard's face grew pale, and he shifted uncomfortably, realizing his position was quickly unraveling. John seized the moment, turning to the guard. Now, I suggest you remove those handcuffs and let my cousin go. He's the victim here, and you know it. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting around the increasingly hostile crowd. Finally, he relented, unlocking the handcuffs and stepping back. John's cousin rubbed his wrists, his eyes rimmed with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice trembling. John reached out and helped his cousin to his feet, supporting him as he steadied himself on his crutch. The crowd parted, allowing them to make their way through, murmuring words of sympathy and support. As they walked, John felt a surge of relief mixed with anger. He couldn't believe the injustice that had just unfolded before his eyes. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. The truth had come out, but he knew the HOA and its security force would not take this lying down. John glanced back at the crowd, now turning their ire towards the cowering guard. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle to hold the HOA accountable and ensure that justice was truly served. As John helped his cousin make his way back to their apartment, a mixture of relief and unease filled the air. The confrontation with the HOA security guard had been intense, but they had managed to expose the truth and prevent a grave injustice. Yet, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The HOA, with its strict rules and powerful security force, was not the kind of adversary to simply back down. He knew they would likely retaliate, and the consequences could be severe. "Are you all right?" John asked, his voice laced with concern as he helped his cousin settle onto the couch. His cousin winced in pain, the exertion of the incident clearly taking a toll on his already weakened body. "I'll be okay," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But what about you?" That guard was ready to arrest both of us. John shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "I couldn't just stand by and watch them treat you like a criminal. You're the victim here, and I had to do something." His cousin reached out and placed a trembling hand on John's arm. "I know, and I'm grateful. But now they're going to come after us, aren't they?" John sighed, his gaze darkening. "I'm afraid so. The HOA doesn't take kindly to anyone challenging their authority, especially when it involves their security team." The cousins sat in uneasy silence for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. John knew they had to be prepared for whatever the HOA had in store. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not when the stakes were so high. Suddenly, a loud knock at the door shattered the stillness. John felt his heart leap into his throat as he exchanged a panicked glance with his cousin. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice trembling. "This is the HOA security team," a gruff voice replied. "We need to speak with you and your cousin immediately." John's mind raced, his palms growing sweaty. He knew they couldn't ignore the summons, but the thought of facing the security guards again filled him with dread. Glancing at his cousin, he saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. But there was also a glimmer of determination, a resolve to stand their ground and fight for the truth. Taking a deep breath, John steeled himself and moved towards the door. He knew that whatever happened next, he had to be ready to face the consequences. The battle for justice had only just begun. John took a deep breath and opened the door, coming face to face with the same burly security guard who had attacked his cousin just moments ago. The guard's expression was a mix of anger and determination, and John knew they were in for a fight. "What do you want?" John asked, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "We need you and your cousin to come with us," the guard replied, his tone brooking no argument. "The HOA board wants to have a word with you." John felt his heart racing, but he refused to back down. "After what you did to my cousin, you expect us to just come quietly? I don't think so." The guard's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his hand hovering near his utility belt. "Look, pal, you can either come with us willingly, or we can make you come. Your choice." John glanced back at his cousin, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and defiance. He knew they couldn't afford to antagonize the security team further, but the thought of willingly walking into the lion's den filled him with unease. "Fine," he said, swallowing hard. "We'll come. But I want to make it clear that we're not admitting to any wrongdoing. We're the victims here, and we're going to make sure the truth comes out." The guard sneered, clearly unconvinced. We'll see about that. Now, let's go. With a resigned sigh, John and his cousin followed the security guard out of the apartment and towards the HOA's central office. As they walked, John couldn't help but feel a sense of dread and uncertainty. He knew that the HOA was not going to go easy on them, and that they would have to be prepared to fight for their rights and their reputations. When they arrived at the office, they were ushered into a large conference room, where several well-dressed individuals were seated around a long table. John recognized the HOA president, a stern-faced woman with a reputation for being unyielding. "Thank you for joining us," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Now let's get down to business. I understand there was an incident involving our security team earlier today." John felt his hackles rise, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes, there was an incident. My cousin was assaulted by one of your security guards, and then he was handcuffed and threatened with arrest, even though he was the victim." The president's eyes narrowed, and she glanced at the security guard. "Is this true, Officer Jacobs?" The guard cleared his throat, his eyes darting around the room. "Well, ma'am, the situation was a bit more complex than that. The individual was causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with my instructions." John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's a lie," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "Your guard attacked my cousin and knocked him to the ground. We have witnesses who saw the whole thing." The president held up a hand, silencing John. "Be that as it may, the HOA takes any disruption to our community very seriously. We have a responsibility to maintain order and ensure the safety of our residents." John felt his blood boil. "So assaulting a disabled person and falsely accusing him of a crime is your idea of maintaining order?" The president's expression hardened. "I understand you feel strongly about this, but the fact remains that you and your cousin were involved in an altercation on HOA property. That is a violation of our community rules, and we cannot ignore it." John opened his mouth to protest, but his cousin reached out and placed a hand on his arm, silently urging him to remain calm. "What do you want from us?" his cousin asked, his voice steady but tinged with barely contained anger. The president leaned back in her chair, a thin smile creeping across her face. "Well, since you asked, we have a few suggestions. For starters, we'd like you both to issue a formal apology to Officer Jacobs and agree to abide by our community rules going forward." John felt his heart drop. This was far from over, and he knew they were going to have to fight tooth and nail to clear their names and hold the HOA accountable. John stared at the HOA president, his disbelief written plainly across his face. "You want us to apologize? After what your security guard did to my cousin?" The president maintained her cool composure, her fingers steepled on the table. "Mr. Flores, I understand you're upset, but the fact remains that your cousin was involved in a disturbance on HOA property. As the governing body, we have a responsibility to address such incidents." John felt his temper flaring, but he knew he had to keep his emotions in check. "With all due respect, Madam President, your security guard is the one who assaulted my cousin and violated his rights. We have witnesses who can attest to that." The president's eyes narrowed. "Be that as it may, we cannot simply take your word for it. As I said, we have a duty to maintain order within our community. If you and your cousin refuse to cooperate, we may be forced to take further action." John's cousin spoke up, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "What kind of further action are you threatening us with? Are you going to have your goons attack me again?" The president's expression darkened. "I would choose my words carefully, young man. We do not take kindly to threats or defiance of our authority." John placed a hand on his cousin's arm, silently urging him to remain calm. "Look, Madam President, we're not here to challenge your authority. We just want justice for what happened to my cousin. Is that really too much to ask?" The president sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Flores, but you have to understand our position. We have a responsibility to all of our residents, not just you and your cousin. If we simply dismiss this incident, it could set a dangerous precedent. John felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He knew they were up against a formidable opponent, one who was unwilling to back down or admit any wrongdoing. "So what are you proposing, then?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The president leaned forward, her gaze fixed on John. "We're willing to let this incident slide, on one condition. You and your cousin agree to a formal mediation session with Officer Jacobs and the resident who was allegedly assaulted." John felt his heart sink. He knew that the HOA was trying to shift the narrative, to paint his cousin as the aggressor and make them both look like troublemakers. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to refuse this offer, not when the consequences could be so severe. Glancing at his cousin, he saw the same resignation and fear reflected in his eyes. They both knew that they were walking into a trap, but they also knew that they had no choice but to play along. "All right," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll do it. But I want it on the record that we're only doing this under protest, and that we still believe we're the victims here." The president nodded, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Very well. We'll have the mediation session scheduled for this Friday. I expect you both to be there, ready to cooperate fully." John and his cousin exchanged a worried glance, both of them knowing that they were about to enter a battle that they couldn't possibly win on their own. The days leading up to the mediation session were a whirlwind of anxiety and uncertainty for John and his cousin. They knew they were walking into a trap, but they also knew that they had no choice but to go along with the HOA's demands. As they prepared for the meeting, John tried to remain optimistic, but the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. He knew that the HOA had the upper hand, and that they would do everything in their power to discredit his cousin and paint them both as troublemakers. When the day of the mediation finally arrived, John and his cousin made their way to the HOA's office, their steps heavy with trepidation. As they entered the conference room, they were greeted by the familiar face of Officer Jacobs, as well as a well-dressed woman who John assumed was the resident they had allegedly assaulted. The HOA president sat at the head of the table, her expression one of calculated neutrality. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice level and measured. "As you know, we've called this mediation session to address the incident that occurred earlier this week." John felt his cousin tense beside him, and he instinctively placed a hand on his arm, a silent gesture of support. "Now, as I understand it, there are two very different accounts of what happened," the president continued. "Officer Jacobs, would you care to share your version of events?" The security guard cleared his throat, his gaze shifting nervously between John and his cousin. "Well, Madam President, I was simply doing my job to maintain order in the community. I responded to a disturbance call and found the gentleman here." He gestured towards John's cousin, causing a scene and refusing to comply with my instructions. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's a lie," he interjected, his voice sharp and accusatory. "Your guard attacked my cousin and knocked him to the ground. We have witnesses who saw the whole thing." The president raised a hand, silencing John. "Please, Mr. Flores, let Officer Jacobs finish." The guard continued, his voice gaining confidence. "As I was saying, the gentleman refused to cooperate, and I had no choice but to restrain him. It was a necessary action to preserve the peace and safety of our community." The woman seated next to Officer Jacobs then spoke up, her voice dripping with indignation. "That's right. My husband and I were simply walking through the courtyard when this man started causing a disturbance. We felt threatened, and were grateful that the officer was there to handle the situation." John felt his blood boil, but he knew he had to keep his composure. "That's not what happened at all. Your husband assaulted my cousin, and your security guard made the situation worse by attacking him. We're the victims here, not the aggressors." The president sighed, shaking her head. "I understand you feel that way, Mr. Flores, but the fact remains that we have two eyewitness accounts that contradict your version of events." John felt his heart sink. He knew they were up against a wall, and that the HOA had no intention of accepting their side of the story. So what happens now? His cousin asked, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. The president leaned forward, her gaze stern. Well, given the conflicting accounts, we've decided that the best course of action is to issue a formal warning to both you and your cousin. Any further disruptions or violations of our community rules will result in more severe consequences, including potential fines or even legal action. John felt his stomach twist into knots. They had come here seeking justice, and instead, they were being treated like the criminals. This isn't fair, he protested, his voice rising in frustration. You're just taking their word over ours, even though we're the ones who were attacked. The president's expression hardened. I'm sorry, Mr. Flores, but that's our decision. If you're not willing to accept it, then we may have to reconsider your status as residents of this community. John felt his heart sink. He knew they were trapped, with no way out. The HOA had the power, and they were determined to use it to crush their dissent. As they left the meeting, John and his cousin walked in silence, the weight of their defeat heavy on their shoulders. They knew that the fight was far from over, but they also knew that they were up against a formidable foe, one that was willing to do whatever it took to protect its own interests. The drive home from the mediation session was tense and silent. John could feel the frustration and anger radiating from his cousin, and he knew that he was feeling the same way. As they pulled into the parking lot of their apartment complex, John turned to his cousin and placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought they would do something like this to us. His cousin shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and defiance. It's not your fault, John. We both knew they were going to do everything in their power to bury the truth. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just can't believe they're getting away with it. That security guard attacked you, and now they're acting like you're the one who did something wrong. His cousin nodded, his jaw clenched tightly. I know. But we can't give up, John. We have to fight this, no matter what. John felt a surge of determination. His cousin was right. They couldn't just let the HOA get away with this. They had to find a way to expose the truth and hold them accountable. Okay, he said, his voice firmer. What's our next move? His cousin paused, his brow furrowed in thought. Well, we know that the HOA is not going to listen to us on our own. We need to find allies, people who can help us build a case against them. John nodded, his mind racing. Maybe we can reach out to the witnesses who saw what happened. See if they're willing to come forward and testify. That's a good start, his cousin replied. But we'll also need to find a way to get the media involved. The HOA is counting on us being silenced, but if we can bring public attention to this, they might have to listen. John's eyes widened. You're right. We need to get the story out there, let people know what's really going on. Maybe we can reach out to some local news outlets, see if they'll pick it up. His cousin nodded, a determined glint in his eye. Exactly. And in the meantime, we need to start gathering as much evidence as we can. Any documentation, photos, or witness statements that can support our case. John felt a surge of energy, his sense of purpose renewed. Okay, let's do it. We're not going to let them get away with this, no matter what they try to do. As they got out of the car and headed towards their apartment, John could feel a newfound sense of resolve. They were up against a formidable opponent, but he knew that they couldn't back down. The truth was on their side, and they were going to fight tooth and nail to make sure it was heard. In the days that followed, John and his cousin worked tirelessly to build their case against the HOA. They reached out to the witnesses who had seen the incident, and one by one, they began to come forward, willing to share their accounts of what had happened. Armed with this testimony, John and his cousin approached several local news outlets, hoping to bring the story to the public's attention. It was a long and arduous process, but they refused to give up, driven by a burning desire for justice. Finally, their persistence paid off. A local television station agreed to cover the story, and within days, the incident was making headlines across the community. The HOA, once so confident in its ability to sweep the matter under the rug, found itself on the defensive. As the public outcry grew, the HOA president was forced to call an emergency meeting, where she was confronted by a crowd of angry residents demanding accountability. John and his cousin were there, their faces resolute, as they presented the overwhelming evidence that proved their innocence. The president, realizing that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, had no choice but to capitulate. With a trembling voice, she publicly acknowledged the HOA's wrongdoing and issued a formal apology to John and his cousin. But the victory was bittersweet. The damage had already been done, and John's cousin would bear the physical and emotional scars of the incident for a long time to come. Still, they took solace in the knowledge that the truth had prevailed, and that the HOA's abuse of power had been exposed for all to see. As they walked away from the meeting, John placed a hand on his cousin's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity and support. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and pride. His cousin nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, we did. And now, maybe things will start to change around here." John couldn't help but agree. The battle had been hard fought, but they had emerged victorious, a testament to the power of perseverance and the unwavering pursuit of justice. As they made their way home, John knew that this was just the beginning, that they would continue to stand up and fight against the forces that threatened to undermine their community's values and their own sense of dignity.